When Luftwaffe intelligence officers first reviewed reports about Canadian-built fighter aircraft entering combat operations over Europe in early 1942, the prevailing reaction ranged from dismissive amusement to outright mockery. These aircraft, manufactured in what German analysts described as converted barns and factories that had previously produced agricultural equipment, seemed unlikely to pose any serious threat to the sophisticated German air superiority that had dominated European skies since the invasion of Poland. One captured intelligence assessment referred to Canadian aviation production as a quaint, colonial endeavor, producing obsolete designs with rustic manufacturing methods. Within 2 years, those same intelligence officers would be frantically analyzing combat loss reports showing Canadian squadrons systematically destroying Germany's most advanced night fighters. The story of Canadian aviation during World War II represents one of the most dramatic reversals of perception in military history, transforming from objects of ridicule to instruments of terror that German pilots learned to fear during the long nights over occupied Europe. This transformation was not the result of technological breakthroughs or superior aircraft design, but rather emerged from a combination of innovative tactics, exceptional pilot training, and a level of aggressive determination that German aviators found both baffling and terrifying. By 1944, Canadian fighter squadrons had established near-complete dominance over contested airspace during night operations, and Luftwaffe pilots were filing reports that described Canadian tactics as unpredictable and dangerously aggressive. The Canadian aviation effort began from almost nothing in the years before the war, as Canada possessed virtually no domestic aircraft industry and maintained only a small peacetime air force focused primarily on training and transport duties. When war broke out in 1939, the Royal Canadian Air Force numbered fewer than 4,000 personnel and operated obsolete aircraft that would have been useless in combat against modern German fighters. The challenge facing Canadian military planners was not simply training pilots, but creating an entire aviation industry capable of producing modern combat aircraft while simultaneously building the infrastructure needed to train thousands of air crews to operational standards. German military intelligence tracking Allied aviation development dismissed Canadian efforts as insignificant throughout 1940 and 1941, focusing instead on the substantial British aviation industry and the emerging American industrial mobilization. Luftwaffe strategic planning assumed that Canadian contributions would be limited to providing training facilities and perhaps some pilots who would serve in British squadrons. The possibility that Canada would develop independent squadrons with distinctive tactical approaches and combat effectiveness that exceeded established RAF units simply did not factor into German strategic calculations. The transformation from dismissed colonial aviation to feared combat force would emerge through factors that German analysts failed to anticipate. The extended training period that Canadian pilots underwent before entering combat, the development of aggressive tactical doctrines that emphasized initiative and adaptability, and the selection process that attracted exceptional volunteers would create squadrons that German pilots learned to identify and avoid when possible. By war's end, the barn-built fighters and colonial pilots that had been objects of Nazi mockery would have compiled combat records that ranked among the most impressive of any Allied air units. The creation of Canadian combat air capability began with the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, an ambitious program that transformed Canada into what became known as the aerodrome of democracy and produced more than 130,000 aircrew members before the war ended. This massive training infrastructure required constructing dozens of new airfields across Canada and developing standardized training curricula that could take raw recruits and transform them into combat-ready pilots within 12 to 18 months. The program represented an enormous investment in facilities and equipment, creating training capacity that would eventually dwarf what Britain could have achieved independently. German intelligence was aware of this training effort but dismissed it as primarily benefiting British squadrons rather than creating independent Canadian air capability. What German analysts failed to recognize was that Canadian training was producing pilots with skills that often exceeded those of British counterparts, largely because Canadian programs emphasized longer flight hours and more comprehensive instruction before pilots were considered operational. While RAF pilots were often rushed into combat after minimal training due to urgent needs for replacements, Canadian pilots typically accumulated hundreds of hours of flight time before they ever saw combat. This extended training allowed development of advanced skills in navigation, instrument flying, and aerial gunnery that would prove decisive in night operations, where visibility was minimal and pilots needed to rely on instruments and instinct. The development of Canadian aircraft manufacturing capacity paralleled the expansion of training infrastructure and proved equally important. Companies that had never built aircraft before the war transformed their facilities to produce fighters and trainers under license from British and American manufacturers. The Hawker Hurricane became the primary Canadian-built fighter in early war years, with production facilities in Montreal and Toronto turning out hundreds of these rugged aircraft. German dismissal of these aircraft as barn-built was not entirely inaccurate, but this rustic origin did not translate to inferior quality. Canadian-built aircraft proved as reliable as those produced in established British factories, and in some cases, Canadian modifications enhanced performance beyond original specifications. The formation of distinctively Canadian squadrons rather than simply feeding pilots into existing RAF units represented a critical decision that shaped how Canadian air power developed. While many Canadian pilots served in RAF squadrons during the Battle of Britain, the creation of numbered RCAF squadrons with Canadian ground crews and command structure created units with strong identity and cohesion. These squadrons developed their own tactical approaches that emphasized aggressive tactics and individual initiative rather than rigid adherence to standard procedures. Pilots were encouraged to experiment with combat techniques and share lessons learned, creating a dynamic environment that rapidly incorporated successful innovations. By late 1942, Canadian squadrons were beginning to establish reputations for aggressive flying and innovative tactics that caught German attention. Early engagements over the English Channel and occupied France demonstrated that Canadian pilots were willing to press attacks closer and pursue enemy aircraft more aggressively than typical RAF procedures recommended. German pilots filing after-action reports began noting encounters with particularly aggressive Allied fighters that seemed to ignore personal safety in pursuit of kills. These reports, initially dismissed as exaggerations from rattled pilots, would accumulate into a pattern that Luftwaffe intelligence could no longer ignore. The transition of Canadian squadrons to night fighter operations in 1943 represented a turning point that would establish their dominance over German aviation in ways that daylight operations had not fully revealed. Night fighting required a completely different skill set than daylight combat, with pilots operating in near-total darkness using primitive radar, equipment, and relying heavily on instrument flying and spatial awareness. The psychological demands were immense, as pilots hunted enemy bombers through blackness where disorientation could be as deadly as enemy fire. Many experienced daylight pilots found themselves unable to adapt to the unique challenges of night operations, but Canadian squadrons proved exceptionally effective in this demanding environment. The German Luftwaffe had pioneered night fighting techniques during the Battle of Britain and maintained sophisticated night fighter forces equipped with advanced radar and experienced crews. These German night fighters had inflicted terrible losses on RAF bomber streams, with single aces accounting for dozens of British aircraft destroyed during night interceptions. Luftwaffe night fighter pilots were among the most experienced and skilled aviators in the German Air Force, flying specialized aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 110 and Junkers Ju 88 equipped with radar that could detect bombers at significant ranges. German confidence in their night fighter superiority was well-founded, based on years of successful operations and technological advantages. Canadian night fighter squadrons flying the Bristol Beaufighter and later the de Havilland Mosquito began operations that systematically challenged German dominance through tactics that emphasized aggressive pursuit and willingness to engage at closer ranges than typical RAF doctrine recommended. Where British night fighters often relied on radar-directed interceptions that allowed engagement from maximum range, Canadian pilots developed techniques that involved closing to visual range before firing. This approach was far more dangerous, requiring pilots to navigate extremely close to enemy aircraft in total darkness, but it dramatically increased accuracy and kill probability. German night fighter crews found themselves being hunted by opponents who appeared suddenly at point-blank range with devastating effect. The Mosquito became the signature aircraft of Canadian night operations, and Canadian squadrons flying this fast, versatile fighter bomber compiled extraordinary combat records. The wooden construction of the Mosquito, built primarily from plywood and balsa, reinforced German perceptions of Commonwealth aircraft as primitive compared to German all-metal designs. Yet this wooden wonder proved faster than most German fighters, could operate at altitudes where German aircraft struggled, and possessed firepower that could destroy bombers and fighters with short bursts. Canadian Mosquito pilots exploited these advantages ruthlessly, developing tactics that turned the hunters into the hunted as they began targeting German night fighters with the same aggressive techniques Germans had used against RAF bombers. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe night fighter losses were climbing dramatically, with an alarming percentage attributed to Canadian squadrons that seemed to operate with reckless aggression that defied German understanding of risk management. German pilots reported encounters where Canadian fighters pursued them through violent, evasive maneuvers, through clouds and into dangerous low-altitude flight regimes where most pilots would break off engagement. The psychological impact of being hunted by unseen opponents who refused to disengage proved devastating to German morale, as night fighter crews who had previously operated with confidence now flew missions knowing they might become targets themselves at any moment. The systematic destruction of German night fighter forces by Canadian squadrons reached its peak during the campaign to protect Allied bomber streams, attacking targets deep in occupied Europe and Germany itself. RAF Bomber Command had suffered catastrophic losses to German night fighters, with some raids losing 10% or more of participating aircraft. The introduction of Canadian night fighter squadrons as escorts and intruders fundamentally changed the calculus of night bombing operations. Canadian Mosquitoes would accompany bomber streams, hunting for German night fighters attempting to intercept the bombers, while other Canadian squadrons conducted intruder operations over German airfields, catching night fighters during vulnerable takeoff and landing phases. The intruder missions represented some of the most dangerous operations in the air war, requiring pilots to penetrate deep into German-controlled airspace, locate enemy airfields in darkness, and attack aircraft and ground installations while under fire from anti-aircraft defenses. Canadian pilots volunteered for these missions in numbers that surprised RAF commanders, demonstrating an aggressive mindset that sought out the most dangerous assignments. The tactics developed for intruder operations showed remarkable innovation, with pilots learning to identify German airfields by observing traffic patterns and exhaust flames from aircraft engines, then timing attacks to catch night fighters when they were most vulnerable during approach and landing, when they were low, slow, and focused on returning safely to base. German night fighter losses to Canadian intruders became so severe that Luftwaffe commanders implemented new procedures requiring fighters to land at alternate airfields and vary their approach patterns to avoid predictable behavior that Canadian pilots could exploit. Despite these countermeasures, Canadian intruder squadrons continued inflicting disproportionate losses, with individual pilots achieving scores that rivaled the tallies of top German aces. The psychological toll on German night fighter crews was immense, as they faced threats not only from Allied bombers they were hunting but from Canadian hunters who pursued them with single-minded determination. German aircrew began showing symptoms of combat fatigue and stress at rates that alarmed Luftwaffe medical officers. The night of the 24th of March 1944 became known in Städte of Vassov, German night fighter circles as Black Thursday, when Canadian squadrons destroyed or damaged more than 30 German night fighters during a single RAF bombing raid on Berlin. Canadian Mosquitoes had positioned themselves along known German approach routes, waiting in darkness until German radar operators vectored night fighters toward the bomber stream. As German fighters climbed to intercept bombers, Canadian pilots attacked from above and behind, using the same tactics Germans had perfected against RAF bombers. The result was carnage, with experienced German crews destroyed before they could effectively respond. Surviving German pilots filed reports describing Canadian attacks as coordinated and ruthlessly executed, demonstrating tactical sophistication that shattered assumptions about colonial aviation competence. The effectiveness of Canadian night operations forced fundamental changes in German defensive strategy, with resources diverted to protect night fighter bases and formations reorganized to provide mutual protection. Yet these defensive measures reduced German effectiveness against bomber streams, achieving exactly what Allied planners had hoped. Canadian squadrons had not just achieved air superiority in contested night skies, but had psychologically broken German night fighter forces that had once seemed invincible. Luftwaffe intelligence assessments from mid-1944 explicitly warned about Canadian night fighter squadrons, identifying them as priority threats and recommending that German crews avoid engagement when outnumbered or surprised. The air superiority achieved by Canadian squadrons over occupied Europe by late 1944 extended beyond night operations to include devastating daylight fighter sweeps and ground attack missions that systematically destroyed German air power on the ground and in the air. Canadian pilots flying Spitfires and Typhoons ranged across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, attacking German airfields, rail yards, supply columns with aggressive tactics that accepted high risk in pursuit of maximum damage to enemy capabilities. The transition from defensive operations protecting Britain to offensive missions deep in enemy territory revealed the full extent of Canadian pilot skill and determination, as squadrons maintained operational tempo that exceeded even veteran RAF units. The Hawker Typhoon became a signature Canadian aircraft during ground attack operations, and Canadian Typhoon squadrons earned fearsome reputations for low-level strikes against German armor and fortifications. This powerful fighter-bomber carried rockets and bombs that could destroy tanks and bunkers, but delivering these weapons required diving attacks that exposed pilots to intensive anti-aircraft fire. Canadian pilots pressed attacks to point-blank range, often sustaining damage from their own weapon explosions due to the proximity of release. German ground forces learned to recognize the distinctive sound of Typhoon engines and the aggressive attack patterns that characterized Canadian squadrons, developing genuine fear of these aircraft that hunted them relentlessly. During the Normandy invasion and subsequent campaign to liberate France, Canadian air squadrons provided close air support that proved decisive in numerous ground engagements. The coordination between Canadian ground forces and Canadian air units created synergies that other Allied armies struggled to replicate, with pilots and ground troops developing communication procedures and mutual understanding that enabled responsive air support when needed most. German commanders noted in captured documents that Canadian ground units seemed to have air support available almost instantly when engaged, a capability that made defensive positions untenable and retreat routes into killing zones where aircraft could attack trapped columns. The toll on Canadian aircrew during these intensive operations was severe, with loss rates that reflected the dangerous nature of low-level ground attack and aggressive fighter tactics. Squadrons lost experienced pilots to anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures, and simple exhaustion as operational tempo remained punishingly high throughout the summer and fall of 1944. The aggressive doctrine that made Canadian squadrons so effective also meant pilots faced cumulative risks that inevitably resulted in losses even when individual missions succeeded. Replacement pilots arriving in squadrons found themselves thrust into combat with minimal transition time, learning advanced tactics through experience that killed those who could not adapt quickly enough. Yet despite heavy losses, Canadian squadrons maintained effectiveness through the final months of the war as Allied forces pushed into Germany. The reputation Canadian pilots had built ensured that German aviators increasingly chose to avoid combat when facing identified Canadian formations, preferring to save their limited aircraft and Abscissida, dwindling fuel supplies for engagements against less aggressive opponents. This psychological dominance represented the ultimate achievement of Canadian air power, having transformed from dismissed colonial aviators into the most feared Allied fighter force in European skies. The barn-built fighters had proven that innovation, training, and courage could overcome any initial disadvantage and establish dominance through sheer determination and skill. The final year of the war saw Canadian air superiority reach absolute dominance as the Luftwaffe collapsed under cumulative losses and resource shortages that left German aviation unable to mount effective resistance. Canadian squadrons ranged across Germany virtually unopposed, attacking targets of opportunity and providing air cover for advancing Allied ground forces. The psychological impact on German civilians and military personnel of seeing Allied aircraft overhead without German fighters to challenge them contributed to the sense of inevitable defeat. Canadian pilots who had trained for years and fought through brutal campaigns now faced an enemy that could barely respond, having achieved the goal of complete air superiority through systematic destruction of German capabilities. The transition from total war to occupation duties came abruptly when Germany surrendered in May 1945, and Canadian squadrons found themselves assigned to peacekeeping and transport missions rather than combat operations. Pilots who had lived with constant danger and adrenaline struggled with the sudden shift to routine patrols and administrative duties. The psychological toll of combat became more apparent during this transition period, as men who had suppressed fear and stress during operations now faced delayed reactions and trauma that required medical attention. Canadian Air Force medical personnel documented high rates of combat fatigue and stress disorders among aircrew, recognizing that the aggressive operational tempo had exacted hidden costs beyond the obvious casualties. The accounting of Canadian air combat effectiveness revealed statistics that validated the transformation from dismissed colonial force to elite combat aviation. Canadian squadrons had achieved kill ratios that exceeded most Allied air units, with some squadrons posting records of 5 or more enemy aircraft destroyed for every Canadian loss. Individual Canadian aces had compiled scores that ranked them among the top Allied pilots of the war, with several achieving more than 20 confirmed victories. The night fighter squadrons, in particular, had established themselves as the most effective Allied force in nocturnal operations, having destroyed more German night fighters than any other Allied air units, despite operating with fewer aircraft and resources than RAF counterparts. German military analysts, conducting post-war assessments of Allied air power, consistently rated Canadian squadrons among the most effective and dangerous opponents Luftwaffe had faced. The combination of aggressive tactics, superior training, and determination to press attacks regardless of risk had created air units that German pilots learned to fear and avoid. Former Luftwaffe officers interviewed after the war expressed surprise that Canadian aviation had achieved such dominance, having initially dismissed Commonwealth air forces as inferior to German capabilities. The realization that pilots flying supposedly primitive aircraft built in improvised factories had systematically defeated Germany's most advanced fighters, and most experienced aviators represented a profound blow to German assumptions about technological and tactical superiority. The cost of Canadian air superiority in human terms was substantial, with more than 17,000 Canadian aircrew killed during the war, from all causes, including combat, training, accidents, and operational losses. This casualty rate reflected the inherently dangerous nature of aviation operations and the obvious, aggressive tactics that Canadian squadrons employed throughout the conflict. Nearly every Canadian who flew combat missions knew comrades who had not returned, creating bonds among survivors and a collective memory of sacrifice that would mark the Canadian Air Force for generations. The transformation from non-existent air power to dominant force had been purchased with the lives of thousands of young men who had volunteered to fly and fight in the deadliest environment of the war. The post-war analysis of Canadian aviation success revealed factors that transcended simple measures of aircraft performance or pilot skill, touching on deeper questions about organizational culture and national character. Canadian squadrons had developed operational approaches that emphasized individual initiative within coordinated frameworks, allowing pilots to adapt tactics to specific situations rather than rigidly following doctrine. This flexibility came from training programs that taught pilots to think critically about combat rather than simply execute memorized procedures, creating aviators who could improvise solutions to unexpected challenges. German Air Force culture, by contrast, had emphasized hierarchical command structures and standardized tactics that proved less adaptable when facing opponents who refused to fight predictably. The volunteer nature of Canadian Air Force recruitment played a significant role in creating squadrons composed of highly motivated individuals who had chosen military aviation rather than been conscripted into service. These volunteers came from across Canada, representing diverse backgrounds and bringing varied skills that enriched squadron capabilities. The selective nature of pilot training meant that only those who demonstrated both technical aptitude and psychological resilience for combat advanced to operational squadrons, creating a concentration of talent that maximized effectiveness. German conscript pilots in the later war years, by contrast, often received abbreviated training and flew missions with inadequate preparation, contributing to the Luftwaffe's declining effectiveness. Canadian tactical innovations in night fighting and ground attack operations influenced Allied air doctrine and provided lessons that shaped post-war aviation development. The aggressive pursuit techniques pioneered by Canadian night fighter pilots became standard practice in jet-age interceptor tactics, while the close air support coordination between Canadian air and ground forces established models for modern combined arms operations. Military analysts studying Canadian operations identified key factors, including realistic training, decentralized command authority, and cultivation of aggressive mindset as critical elements that other air forces should emulate. The barn-built fighters had proven that doctrine and pilot quality mattered more than manufacturing sophistication. The psychological dimension of Canadian air dominance represented an often overlooked aspect of their effectiveness, as the reputation for aggressive tactics created fear in German aviators that magnified Canadian tactical advantages. German pilots who believed they faced particularly dangerous opponents often flew more cautiously or avoided engagement entirely, allowing Canadian squadrons to achieve objectives with less resistance than expected. This psychological warfare effect demonstrated that reputation and morale could be as decisive as material factors in determining combat outcomes. The transformation from objects of mockery to sources of fear had taken less than 3 years but fundamentally altered the strategic balance in European skies. The legacy of Canadian World War II aviation extended far beyond the immediate military achievements to shape Canadian national identity and post-war military development. The success of Canadian squadrons demonstrated that Canada could compete with and exceed the capabilities of established military powers when provided with resources and opportunities to develop indigenous capabilities. This realization contributed to Canadian demands for greater independence from British oversight and recognition as a significant middle power in post-war international relations. The men who flew barn-built fighters to victory over the Luftwaffe had proven that national will and innovative thinking could overcome material disadvantages and establish Canada as a serious military force. The human stories behind Canadian aviation statistics revealed the personal sacrifices and individual courage that created aggregate success in combat operations. Young men barely out of their teens had volunteered for aircrew duty, knowing the casualty rates were among the highest in military service, accepting risks that would have deterred more cautious individuals. Many came from small towns and rural communities across Canada, seeking adventure and opportunity to contribute to the war effort in meaningful ways. The training pipeline transformed civilians into combat aviators through intensive programs that tested physical and mental limits, washing out those who could not meet demanding standards while preparing survivors for the brutal realities of aerial combat. The bonds formed between squadron members created tight-knit communities where pilots relied on each other for survival and emotional support through the stress of continuous operations. These relationships often proved deeper than family ties, forged through shared danger and collective trauma that civilians could not understand or appreciate. When squadron mates were lost in combat or accidents, survivors mourned privately while maintaining operational focus, suppressing grief until missions were complete. This emotional compartmentalization took psychological toll that would manifest years later in many veterans. But during the war, it enabled squadrons to maintain effectiveness, despite accumulating losses that would have broken less cohesive units. Canadian Air Force leadership, from squadron commanders through to senior officers, played crucial roles in fostering the aggressive tactical culture while maintaining discipline and operational safety. The best leaders balanced encouragement of initiative with appropriate risk management, pushing pilots to achieve maximum effectiveness without needlessly squandering lives through reckless operations. These leaders often flew combat missions alongside their pilots, earning respect through shared danger rather than commanding from safe rear positions. German prisoners expressed surprise when learning that senior Canadian air commanders had recent combat experience, contrasting with German leadership structure that increasingly separated high command from frontline realities. The technological evolution of Canadian-operated aircraft through the war years reflected both industrial maturation and changing tactical requirements. Early war Hurricanes gave way to Spitfires for air superiority, while Beaufighters and Mosquitoes dominated night operations and Typhoons excelled at ground attack. Canadian pilots adapted to each new aircraft type, learning unique characteristics and optimal employment techniques through training and combat experience. The diversity of aircraft types operated by Canadian squadrons demonstrated versatility that served Allied strategic needs, while giving Canadian aviators experience with wide range of capabilities and missions. This operational flexibility meant Canadian squadrons could be assigned to varied missions with confidence they would perform effectively. The recognition that Canadian aviation achievements deserved came slowly and incompletely during the war years, as public attention focused primarily on strategic bombing campaigns and fighter operations over Britain, rather than the specialized missions where Canadian squadrons excelled. Canadian night fighter successes rarely made headlines, despite their strategic importance, and ground attack operations were often reported without identifying the specific units involved. This lack of recognition frustrated Canadian aircrews who felt their sacrifices and achievements were being overlooked or attributed to British forces in general, rather than Canadian squadrons specifically. Post-war historical work would eventually document Canadian contributions more thoroughly, but during the war many achievements went unacknowledged outside military circles. The immediate post-war period brought difficult transitions for Canadian aviation as squadrons demobilized and veterans returned to civilian life, carrying experiences that separated them from those who had not served. Many former combat pilots struggled to find purpose in peacetime occupations after years of flying cutting-edge aircraft in life-or-death situations that demanded constant excellence. The commercial aviation industry absorbed some veterans, but many found peacetime, flying tame, compared to combat operations. Others left aviation entirely, seeking to distance themselves from memories and trauma associated with wartime service. The dispersion of squadron communities that had sustained men through the war left veterans isolated, lacking the support networks that had helped them cope with stress and loss. Canadian society honored returning veterans with parades and recognition ceremonies, but these public celebrations often felt hollow to men who had lost close friends and witnessed horrors that civilians could not comprehend. The gap between veteran experience and civilian understanding created silence around war stories, with many veterans choosing not to discuss their service even with family members. This silence protected civilians from disturbing realities but also isolated veterans and made psychological recovery more difficult. The aggressive combat effectiveness that had made Canadian squadrons so feared came with hidden costs in trauma and psychological injury that would affect veterans for decades after the war ended. The question of whether the human cost of Canadian aviation achievements had been justified provoked ongoing debate among veterans and historians. Some argued that aggressive tactics had shortened the war by achieving air superiority faster than cautious approaches would have accomplished, thereby saving lives overall. Others questioned whether the same objectives could have been achieved with more conservative tactics that accepted slower progress in exchange for reduced casualties. There were no clear answers to these moral questions, only the recognition that men had done what they believed necessary under impossible circumstances. The pilots who died in barn-built fighters deserved remembrance not just as statistics demonstrating effectiveness but as individuals who had sacrificed everything. The evolution of Canadian military aviation after World War II reflected lessons learned from wartime, experience, and continued the emphasis on high-quality training and aggressive doctrine. The Royal Canadian Air Force maintained fighter squadrons that would serve with distinction in the Korean War and throughout the Cold War, carrying forward traditions established by the men who had defeated the Luftwaffe. Modern Canadian fighter pilots studied the tactics and achievements of their World War II predecessors, drawing inspiration from the transformation from dismissed colonial force to elite combat aviation. The barn-built fighters had proven that determination and innovation could overcome any initial disadvantage, a lesson that remained relevant long after the aircraft themselves had been retired. The reconciliation between former enemies came gradually as post-war decades passed and former Luftwaffe pilots acknowledged the skill and courage of Canadian aviators they had faced in combat. Veterans meetings brought together men who had tried to kill each other in the skies over Europe, finding common ground in shared experiences of aerial combat and mutual respect for the sacrifices made by both sides. These encounters revealed that the Germans who had initially mocked Canadian aviation had learned through bitter experience to respect capabilities that exceeded their expectations. The transformation from mockery to respect to mutual acknowledgement represented the full arc of Canadian aviation's wartime journey. The final assessment of Canadian aviation contributions to Allied victory reveals accomplishments that far exceeded what anyone could have reasonably predicted when war began in 1939. A nation with virtually no domestic aircraft industry and minimal air force had built an aviation training infrastructure that produced more than 130,000 aircrew, created combat squadrons that achieved air superiority against one of the world's most advanced air forces, and established tactical innovations that influenced military aviation for generations. This achievement required transforming Canadian industrial capacity, developing training programs that produced exceptional pilots, and fostering organizational culture that valued aggression and initiative. The combination of these factors created air power that punched far above its weight and earned genuine respect from enemies who had initially dismissed it as insignificant. The human cost of building this capability must be remembered alongside the achievements, as more than 17,000 Canadian aircrew died in service and thousands more were wounded or captured. Each of these casualties represented an individual story of courage and sacrifice. Young men who volunteered knowing the dangers and flew missions that many would not survive. The aggressive tactics that made Canadian squadrons so effective necessarily increased risks and resulted in losses that might have been avoided through more cautious operations. Whether these additional casualties were justified by faster achievement of air superiority remains a question that cannot be answered definitively, only acknowledged as the terrible calculus of war, where leaders must balance effectiveness against cost in human lives. The transformation of Canadian national identity through aviation achievements paralleled the impact of ground force successes, demonstrating that Canada could stand as an independent military power rather than simply a British dominion. The pilots who flew barn-built fighters to dominance over German aviation proved Canadian capability on the world stage and contributed to post-war recognition of Canada as a significant middle power deserving respect and voice in international affairs. This psychological transformation from colony to independent nation was purchased through the blood and sacrifice of those who served, giving tangible evidence that Canada had earned its place through demonstrated competence and courage rather than simply inherited status. The enduring lesson of Canadian World War II aviation lies in the demonstration that effectiveness comes from factors beyond industrial capacity or technological superiority. The pilots who German aviators learned to fear were not flying superior aircraft or equipped with secret weapons, but rather were ordinary men made extraordinary through exceptional training, innovative tactics, and determination to press attacks regardless of danger. This human dimension of military effectiveness transcends specific technologies or historical contexts, remaining relevant for understanding how smaller forces can achieve disproportionate impact through excellence and aggressive execution of sound doctrine. The barn-built fighters proved effective, not because of superior construction, but because of the men who flew them and the tactical approaches they pioneered. In the final accounting, the Nazi pilots who mocked Canadian barn-built fighters learned the hardest lesson of warfare, that dismissing opponents based on preconceptions rather than demonstrated capability is a potentially fatal mistake. The transformation from objects of ridicule to rulers of the night sky took only a few years but fundamentally altered the strategic balance in European skies and contributed decisively to Allied victory. The men who achieved this transformation deserve remembrance not just for their combat effectiveness but for their individual courage and the sacrifices they made in service of a cause greater than themselves. Their legacy endures in the traditions of Canadian military aviation and in the broader lesson that determination, training, and innovative thinking can overcome any initial disadvantage when applied with courage and commitment.